Wait, so if my fantasy is more episodes of Star Trek Lower Decks, does that mean by watching it I'm gonna turn to stone? Oh crap! Hello interwebs, it is my favorite time of week because it is a brand new episode of Star Trek Lower Decks Season 3, this time Episode 3, Mining the Mind's Mime. Mining the Mind's Mime. I think I got it there. This is what happens when you just had a surgery on your mouth recently and everything just turns to mush and then they throw you tongue twisters and titles. I don't like this, Lower Decks. Why are you doing this to me? This is straight up transphobia. I'm calling it now. You're being transphobic because I can't speak. Anyways, me calling everything transphobic aside, let me start off spoiler-free before we get into spoilers about this episode. This was another strong episode of Lower Decks, as pretty much every episode of Lower Decks is, though I will say this probably wasn't my favorite of this season so far. I do think that there's a lot of really strong stuff, like there's some clever gags and some utilizations of some like Star Trekian tropes to give us some good references, as well as some really great and like over-the-top visuals that I never thought I would see in Star Trek that are amazing, as well as some really great character arcs as well for specifically Tendi. But beyond those moments, I do think some of the jokes in this one are a little bit overlong. They go on just a little bit long for me, and I ultimately do think that it kind of brings down the episode just a bit because they're just kind of overused. Don't really do anything specifically special or over the top enough for me, or like reveal character enough for me to make them feel like they're like top tier jokes. But that being said, I do think they're strong. They're just not as strong as I think they could have been. That all being said, though, going back to end on a positive before I get into spoilers, this episode does do what I am really appreciating this season for, in that it is at pushing our characters' arcs and stories forward. One of my biggest problems with Lower Decks Season 2 was that it kind of spent the first half of its season sort of resetting the status quo to what we had already seen in Season 1. It wasn't really pushing things forward enough for me. It was sort of like taking a lot of work to bring our characters back to where they already were at the end of Season 1. In sort of resetting it back at the beginning of Season 2, whereas here, specifically with the character of Tendi, but a little bit with Mariner in here as well, we're starting to see our characters actually move forward in their character arcs and journeys, instead of just sort of like resetting things back to where they were. And so I'm really, really enjoying that. Like, I love it when the shows actually start to push their characters forward and getting us to see their continual growth. And we're also starting to see something that I was mentioning I wanted to see more of last episode, which is character arcs for characters like Tendi. We already kind of know what's going on with Boimler and Mariner this season, so now we're getting to start to see a little bit of Tendi. Now, we didn't get a lot of Rutherford this episode, so hopefully that's coming up in the near future, but I do like that each one of our characters has now been sort of set up, besides Rutherford, to have like an arc going into the rest of this season. So, some strong work here. But with all that being said, let us get into spoilers so I can talk about all my specifics. Alright, so we have a cold open on this episode that's actually kind of fun and unique, where we get to see a scientist on this weird Star Trekian planet encountering a weird orb, and then encountering one of his fantasies, his high school teacher in a sexy like Greek god outfit. Kind of reminds me of that one episode of Star Trek the original series. Kind of reminded me of that. And then obviously he has like fan fiction work. He's like, oh yeah, I wrote this book and I put myself in an author insert, kind of making fun of like the Mary Sue type of characters that Star Trek originated, by the way. Mary Sue's came from Star Trek fan fiction, at least the concept of them. So I think that was a nice little reference. And yet we get like bits like this where it's like, aha, hot sexy lady, and like fan fiction-y type stuff, which again is not funny. Like, I'm laughing, but there's a certain part of me that's like, oh, you could have gone like way over the top with our fantasies, and we do get a moment of that. Like, I'm not denying that comes later on, and we do get to see some weird and crazy stuff, which I do appreciate. But from there we get our opening credits and we get into the meat of the episode, and I kind of enjoyed that we kind of pick up like a little while after that initial cold open, because we kind of realized that there was a whole like Star Trek episode that happened between that opening cold open and what we're seeing now, in that we got to see the USS Hood had sort of come in and done what we would see in like an episode of Next Generation, where they like discovered the mystery of what was going on with this rock planet and like what these fantasy orbs were. Like, we can kind of intuit like that's what happened between this, and now we're dealing with the Cerritos crew, as well as this other crew of the Carlsbad, another California class ship, sort of doing the cleanup, mop-up stuff, which is, again, what this crew does. They do the cleanup, mop-up, second contact work after the big ships come in. So it was nice to sort of like get that reminder of where the Cerritos stands within like the Starfleet mission prerogative, and that there was like a whole episode of Star Trek that happened in between here. That was kind of cool. But ultimately, we learned from Ransom that there were these rock people called the Scrubble living on this planet that had used these like fantasy orbs to influence these sort of Federation scientists that were there. And now it's the Cerritos and Carlsbad's job to clean up everything, clean up these orbs, and take apart these scientist outpost. And I love Ransom, like, giving this whole thing about, like, oh, man, these Federation scientists could have actually, like, gone to Starfleet and done all this, but they always get into trouble because they go out and be on the frontier, kind of making fun of that Star Trek trope of, like, these Federation scientists always getting into trouble and needing to be helped out by the Enterprise or whatever. But then we get the return of Stevenson, who is always constantly sharing about how he has a sacred bond with Ransom, which clearly makes Ransom uncomfortable. I love this like recurring joke with this character that he was in season 1 a little bit and had that relationship, but it seemed more reciprocal then. It was when we got into season 2 that we got to see that Ransom was uncomfortable with it, and I liked just seeing the development of that here. So great little bit with Stevens. But then we get Tendi starting her senior science officer training. And again, I love this. I love seeing that Tendi is developing as a character and going into the sciences, sort of pushing beyond what we saw last season, where she's working as a doctor, and how Dr. Ta'ana said it pushed her into becoming something bigger than that. And I thought that was just, it was nice to see that growth for her continuing here. I also love Rutherford's line that he wants to go with his brain being exploded by science. That was great. But then we get to see Tendi meeting her science mentor, who is the therapist, Dr. Miglimo, who we met way back in season 1, episode 9, played by the wonderful Paul F. Tompkins. I adore Paul F. Tompkins. His like cadence is always like so unique and specific, and I love his like weirdly positive and yet somewhat off-kilter vibe. He does it really well, and I love him as Dr. Miglimo. And clearly he's not really a good mentor. I loved all this bit where he's like, too many sciences, if you ask me, and Tendi being like, I think there's a proper amount of sciences. But his advice is ultimately good for Tendi, because he's like, you need to speak up for science. Like, yes, it's important to know all about different sciences like Spock did and, data and all that stuff. But a lot of the time you need to be an advocate for seeing things from that point of view, not just the sort of command, like straightforward way, but like being the voice of science is an important aspect of that role. And I liked that sort of being actually coherent advice from Dr. Miglimo. And so he gives that task to Tendi to be the captain's voice of science in this episode. But that splinters their story off because they have the rest of our lower deckers going down to the planet where they are helping clean up the sort of mined rocks, and they meet the crew of the Carlsbad, who seem to have a little bit of an understanding of the Cerritos having this like reputation, and they seem very off-putting. Ultimately, we know that's going to be subverted in just a little bit here, but the Cerritos crew feeling like, oh wow, they're trying to show us up. They're trying to say that they're better than us because we have this sort of like reputation. Apparently, they assume a bad reputation, so they try to outshine them by sort of cleaning up faster than them, which is just a fun little bit. And then we get to see some of our lower deckers fantasies as they pick up these sort of like mind fantasy balls, and there's some fun ones here. Like, for example, we got to see Rutherford's fantasy is Leah Brahms, the engineer of the USS Enterprise D, who is from the episodes of The Next Generation, Booby Trap, and I want to say Galaxy's Child. Basically, Geordi's like a holodeck fantasy girl who he ultimately meets in real life and is like, oh yeah, I might have had a parasocial relationship here. It's a little bit awkward. So it was nice to hear, and it was actually played by Sarah Gibney, who played Leah Brahms in those episodes. So it was nice to see that little reference there. And of course, Rutherford would have a fantasy of her. And then obviously I love Boimler's little bit where his fantasy was that he was sort of like being asked to go and help defeat the Borg, but even he's in a sidecar in his own fantasy. He's like, I'm a natural passenger. Perfect Boimler. Perfect Boimler. But this does bring me to the fantasy that I have the most thoughts about, and that is Mariner having sort of fantasy dreams about her girlfriend, Jennifer. So first off, I thought this was funny, like her Mariner being kind of embarrassed that she's kind of having like sexual fantasies about her girlfriend, and that's actually kind of sweet. It's like nice that you're like kind of sexually interested in your girlfriend. I think that that's wonderful. And there was a part of me that initially like kind of balked at that was sort of like, oh look, it's like the girl being all sexy, but I actually kind of liked it because it showcased again Mariner having a healthy sexual interest in her girlfriend, and then also just showcasing that like it was a bisexual woman having an interest in a girl when we had already seen Mariner in previous seasons having sexual interest in men, like going back all the way to the pilot episode of the series where she had that sort of like fantasy gym sequence with a bunch of dudes around. So I like, oh, she has like sexual interest in both men and women, and really highlighting like, yes, she's bisexual. And that also kind of fits Lower Decks as like a very sexually active show generally. So I thought that that was good. One thing that I will say though with this is, well, I did enjoy this and the further confirmation that Mariner is in a relationship with Jennifer, which I like seeing that continuation from the finale of season 2. I do hope we get to see Mariner and Jennifer getting to actually interact as girlfriends within like an actual setting, because we actually haven't seen any of Jennifer up until this point this season, and I would like to see a little bit of them being together in an actual situation, not just these fantasies moments, which could be considered like fetishizing that relationship. I don't think that's the case here, but if they only show that, then that would be a problem. But if we get to see in the next few episodes Jennifer and Mariner being together and actually like having interactions together, then I think it'll ultimately be fine. But it's something that's like, I'm going to keep an eye on that going forward if that does show up, because if they like break up off screen or we don't get to see anything, then I'm going to have more of a problem with it. As it stands here though, I think this is fine, and I was laughing at it. But then the Lower Deckers try to show up the other crew by, like, sort of throwing these fantasy things in as basketballs, and that was all great. But then Stevens shows up and sort of yells at them, but they manage to play off his ego with Ransom in getting him to also shove these fantasy balls in there as well. And I love it, like, uses his, like, uniform to, like, not touch them and, like, juggles it, and that's what causes it to fall on the ground. And then it causes them all to break, causing all of the fantasy orbs to start causing their nightmares to appear. And these are great. I mean, I think the most obvious one is we get I can never pronounce its name, but the like sky serpent thing that we see, which I think is called Kukulkan. I think that's how you say it.
But one in your midst knows my name. You will be given one chance to succeed where your ancestors failed. Fail me again, and all of your kind shall perish.
Mr. Walking Bear, how do you know who's aboard that ship?
I am a Comanche captain. I've studied the histories of many ancient Earth peoples, especially my own. That ship out there bears a strong resemblance to a god in Mayan and Aztec legends, Kukulkan.
From the Star Trek The Animated Series episode, How Sharper Than the Serpent's Tooth is, I think, the name. So it was like a nice little reference to the animated series there. But then some of these other visualizations, we got like a Borg snake and like Klingon clowns, and then werewolf Jennifer was really cool. Like all of those visuals, I loved them. They were just so creative and over the top. And this is what I kind of wanted to see with these like fantasy things. I thought that they were all very creative. Also, during all this like crazy nonsense stuff where we get Stevenson's getting picked up and dropped and then broken, I'm like, damn, did they kill Stevens? I thought that he was actually like legitimately dead there for a little bit, which is why I was glad to see him come back up at the end of the episode. But then our crew gets stuck in a cave with the Carlsbad crew, and we ultimately learn that the Carlsbad crew didn't think that the Cerritos had a bad reputation, but they want to like try to live up to the Cerritos reputation, because the Cerritos is seen as the Enterprise of the support ships, which I think was like really clever. It's like showcasing like how everything that we've seen over the past 2 seasons has put the Cerritos in a sort of higher echelon of the support ships. It always is funny how when you watch shows like this, like whatever like ship or crew that you're watching always ends up being like the like most interesting one. I mean, that's obviously going to be the case with like a TV show. You're going to want to watch the most interesting crew, but it's always just kind of funny how that always tends to happen. Like our characters always become legends in their own right, and I like this sort of playing off of that trope. But eventually our crew goes in to learn that these orbs are actually recording more than just their nightmares and their fantasies, but all of their thoughts, which leads us back over to Tendi's storyline. This is where I had elements that I really, really loved, and I also thought some of the jokes were going over long, because we have this bit where the Scrubble and the scientists sort of give Captain Freeman, as well as the Carlsbad's captain, this rock, and then the captains sort of duke it out and fight each other over who gets to keep the rock. And I get that this is highlighting Freeman's sort of like ego and the kind of character flaw that we've seen her have over the past 2 seasons of the show, but I did think that this sort of joke of them like fighting over who gets to have the rock to be a tad childish in a way that I didn't find terribly funny, and also felt a little bit overlong. Like the fact that they were arguing about this for so long, I don't know, the joke just didn't work for me. And I think that was the biggest failing of the episode for me, was this joke just didn't really land as hard as it could have for me. However, it does lead to my favorite moment of the episode, where Tendi like tries to speak up for stuff, and she tries to scan the rock and speak up for science, but and finds that there's like strange energies about it, but she ultimately can't convince anybody, and so she gives up and goes back to sickbay, where Dr. T'Ana gives her an actual inspiring speech, like, you can do this, you just believe in yourself, sometimes you have to break things before you can put it back together. And also around this, like, one dude's like, wait, you're gonna cut off my leg? And then her like pulling out the chainsaw was hysterical. But I just, this was my favorite moment, this like sort of sweet mentor moment between Dr. T'Ana and Tendi. I really loved. Favorite moment of the episode. And then Tendi going up and actually standing up for science, breaking it, and uncovering that the Scrubble and the Federation scientists were working together to try and get Starfleet secrets by putting this rock into a captain's sort of ready room and getting all that information. So nice little reveal there, a nice little twist and subversion on all of this stuff. And then Shaq sort of like stopping them from getting out of there. I thought all of that was wonderful. And so I thought that this was a great moment for Tendi and her character, even if I didn't find the overall joke to be the best. I did think these moments within it were excellent. And here is where we have Stevens coming back. He seems to have just arms and legs in cast, which I thought was good. I was, like I said, I was a little bit shocked. I was worried that he had actually died earlier. But I do love that he references, like, well, if I was dead, why did I see a koala? Referencing the koala that has been brought up several times in the series. I just love this recurring gag in Lower Decks that the entire of the Star Trek universe is, like, on the back of an all-seeing koala. Like,
the universe is balanced on the back of a giant koala! Why is he smiling? What does he know?
The weirdest and out there yet best joke. I every time the koala is referenced, I adore it.
I saw a koala.
Yeah, you know, it's probably best you just keep that to yourself.
But then we get a sweet little ending where sort of the Cerritos and Carl's bad crew sort of reconnect and just sort of like sharing how cool the Cerritos crew and the reputation that they have is. And I thought that that was all wonderful. And then just the last joke where people are like, yeah, we didn't know that Boimler was actually people. He thought he was like a robot trying to learn how to be a person. And Boimler's like, no, I'm people. Come on, I'm people. Very sweet end to the episode. So overall, I don't think this was my favorite episode of Lower Decks, yet it does have some very sweet moments and some wonderful like references and jokes overall. So again, not my favorite, but still very enjoyable and a fun episode to boot. So that is my thoughts on the latest episode of Star Trek Lower Decks, but I'd love to hear all of your thoughts down in the comments below. Let me know what you think. But beyond all of that, thank you so much for watching as always, and hope that you, as always, my friends, live long and prosper.